Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everyone participating in today's webinar, Harnessing the Power of Excel, Tips and Tricks for Financial Professionals. My name is Brandon Mullins, and I'll be the moderator and a presenter for today's webinar. I'm a senior accountant at GRF, working with both for-profit and nonprofit clients, providing full-cycle accounting and controllership services in the outsourced accounting and advisory department. I'd like to start off today with some quick housekeeping items and explain what you'll need to do to earn CPE credit. Participants seeking CPE credit today must complete and submit a short evaluation survey that will appear automatically immediately following the webinar. You'll be asked to recall these words in order to receive credit. Remember to please write these words down when they are given and keep them until you receive your certificate, as they will not be provided again. If you have any technical questions or issues during the webinar, please use the questions function to speak with our webinar administrator for assistance. The slide deck and recording from today's webinar will be available for download at the link shown here. You'll also be able to receive a follow-up email with direct links. The technical support and CPE questions may be addressed to Dominic Acosta at dacosta@grfcpa.com. Today's learning objective is to understand the tools necessary for planning, forecasting, and budgeting in Microsoft Excel. I would now like to introduce your other presenters for today's webinar. Ian Schuman is a partner at GRF in the Outsourced Accounting and Advisory Services Department. Ian provides audit accounting and consulting services to tax-exempt organizations and for-profit businesses at various stages of development. He is proficient in several accounting software packages and a certified pro advisor in QuickBooks and QuickBooks Online. He frequently advises clients on best practices for setting up their accounting systems. Yevgeny Sohinko is a supervisor at GRF in the Outsourced Accounting and Advisory Services Department. He is responsible for providing full cycle accounting services to an extensive number of clients. I will now turn over the presentation to Yev.
Great, thanks, Brandon. So we'd like to start off today's webinar with basically running through the key tabs in Excel and just highlighting some of the most commonly used features that we like to use in our practice. So if we start off in the Home tab, as you can see above, what we have here is a sample data set of basically salespeople and their sales amounts for 2018. And the first feature we'd like to highlight is called conditional formatting. And as the name implies, what that allows you to do is basically format cells based on conditions that are met. So in our example, what we're going to do is highlight any of the cells appearing in this range here in a green color if it meets the condition of being greater than the sales goal presented here. So to do that, we again are in the Home tab. And then when we have our data set selected where we want to apply the conditional formatting to, we'll click on conditional formatting, and then we'll click highlight cells rules, and then greater than. And then when this window pops up, what it's asking us is, what is your condition? In this case, what number do these cells have to be greater than to meet your condition? But in our case, we're going to set our condition to this cell value here, which in this case is 100,000. And then we'll go here and tell Excel when that condition is met, highlight those other cells in green. And you can see as soon as we do that, now all of these cells are highlighted in green because they are all greater than our sales goal of 100,000. And what's powerful about conditional formatting is because we set the condition to this cell, as soon as I update this cell to a different amount, you'll very quickly notice that Excel is doing the work of formatting the cells based on that condition. So it allows you to, again, quickly apply formatting rules to a set of cells based on any conditions that you define. Next, if we move along to the Insert tab, what we'd like to highlight here is this Object feature. And what the object allows you to do is basically create a link to a document that appears as an icon in your Excel file, and it allows you to open up that file directly in your Excel. So as an example, in the object window, we click on create from file, and then we browse to the file that we want to link into our Excel. And as an example, if I use this file here and I click this display as icon button, you'll now notice that that icon appears directly in my Excel file, so that when I open it up and double click it, that file opens up directly as a separate document. And some of you probably use the hyperlink feature. The key distinction between using object and hyperlink is that hyperlink is basically only going to work if that same file that you're linking to exists on your computer, whereas using an object allows you to send this Excel file to somebody that doesn't have that same file on their computer, and they should still be able to open up the icon and open up that file on their computer. The one thing also to note with objects is that it increases the file size of your Excel file, so be kind of wary of adding too many objects to your Excel. Next, if we move along to the Formulas tab, very quickly, I just want to highlight the error checking feature. I'm sure some of you have run into issues with circular references and other types of errors in your Excel. So the error checking just allows you to quickly determine where those errors are and, more importantly, how to fix them. So just note that that's there. Next, if we move along to the Data tab, what I'd like to highlight here are a few features. First one being the text to columns. And what text to columns allows you to do is basically split out cells into separate columns. So in this case, as you can see, we have a data set that is basically a date separated by a comma, then a vendor name, again separated by a comma, and then an amount. And what we'd like to do is separate these pieces of information into separate columns so that we can apply data analysis afterwards to that. So to do that, we select our set of cells that we want to transform into separate columns, hit text to columns at the top, and in this case, we're going to select delimited, and we hit next. And in our case, our separator is a comma, so we're going to select comma here. And then if we click finish, you'll now notice that our data has been separated into separate columns so that now we can analyze it as we need to. And one of the easiest and most common methods of data analysis in Excel is this filter, which also again is under the Data tab. And if we click that, now we can very quickly apply filters to our data and analyze it as need be. Next, if we move along, but staying within the Data tab, just very quickly, we want to highlight the Remove Duplicates feature. And that, again, as the name implies, just removes any duplicate values from a set of cells that you tell it to remove the duplicates from. So in our case, we want to remove all the duplicates. As we can see, there's multiple instances of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So very simply, we just select the data set, hit Remove Duplicates, and now we just select the column to remove the duplicates from. And if we hit OK, sorry about that, we had a teeny bit of background noise. And if we hit OK, you'll now see that Excel has removed our duplicates from our data set. So we're just left with the 4 distinct values, in this case, the names presented here. And also moving along to the Review tab, what I want to point out here is just the protection features. So you can protect an entire sheet or your entire workbook in Excel using passwords. So in this example, if I just want to protect this sheet that I am on here, and I type in a password and hit OK, and then confirm the password, now you'll notice if I try to do anything, type in any of the values or try to delete a value, it won't let me because the sheet is protected. So again, you can apply the protection at a workbook level or a sheet level, and that just allows you to ensure data integrity and make sure people aren't making unnecessary changes to your Excel file. And moving to the View tab, very quickly just want to highlight this new window button. What this does is create basically a copy of your Excel file so that you can quickly compare and contrast sheets in your data set very quickly without having to scroll back and forth between tabs. And you'll see that the new window that was created has a colon and then a 2 to indicate that it's the second copy. And here's the original. And again, the beauty here is you can have one window set to one tab, your other window set to another tab, and you can have them side by side so you can quickly compare and contrast and identify any differences as need be. And when you're done with the other copy of your Excel, you just X out the second window and you're basically back to square one. So finally, I just like to highlight another tool that's good for ensuring data integrity, and it's the drop-down list, and it's located in the data tab, and it's the data validation feature. In this case, what we'd like to do is basically restrict users' input to what we have presented here. So instead of allowing the user to type in whatever they want in these cells, we're going to make sure that they can only select southeast, west, north, or south. And to do that, we will select the set of cells where we want to apply those restrictions, and then click on data validation again. Under settings, we're going to click allow, and we're going to allow from a list of cells. And in this case, our source or our list of cells is going to be these cells here. And when we click OK, now you'll notice that this little drop-down arrow appears, so that the only values we can select here are the ones in this list here. And if we try to type in anything other than that list there, it will give us an error. And again, the key point here is that using data validation allows you to ensure that users, again, are not typing in incorrect values into cells. And as Ian will cover a little later in our webinar, that will be useful for ensuring that all of your formulas and functions work properly in Excel. And with that, we have reached our first polling question. And our question is, how would you rate your overall Excel skills? Would you rate them as basic, intermediate, advanced, or power user?
Please now take a moment to answer the question. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the first CPE word. The first CPE word is Excel. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you'll need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the first CPE word is Excel, E-X-C-E-L.
All right, so here we can see the results of it, and it's a pretty clear victory for intermediate with 60% of you, and that's what I would expect. There's a range of different skill levels. There's some power users out there, some people that are basic, advanced, but most of the crowd's going to be in the middle somewhere. So hopefully you all get some tricks out of here you didn't know coming in, and then you'll probably see some that you did know already, so that's fine. So that's going to bring us into the second chapter of the webinar, so thank you. The next topic is to talk about functions. Functions are essentially a command that you give to Excel, and you have to provide certain input, and based on that input, Excel is going to perform some task or function, and then do its thing and give you back certain output. The trick then with functions is to make sure that you're providing the right input so that your output is both accurate and what you're expecting, what you're after. The idea with all of these is that they save you time, they can increase the accuracy of what you're doing, and it's also kind of an opportunity for good spreadsheet design, meaning there can be fewer hard-coded things in your spreadsheet and more references. There are about 500 of these built into Excel. We're going to cover a couple of them. We're going to start with a little bit of an icebreaker, talking about some reference ones, left, right, mid, and a related one, which is find. Then we'll talk about SUMIF and VLOOKUP, and then we'll go back to YEV for COUNTIF. So in my first scenario here, I've got in column A a series of, this is a segmented account number structure, 4 digits that are an account number and then a dash and a department code or maybe a job code. And what I want to do is just separate the account and the department. So right away, I'm sure there's some of you thinking, well, geez, can't I just use text to columns like we just saw? And certainly there are many times in Excel where it gives you multiple tools to accomplish the same thing. But it's good to just have additional tools in the tool belt. In one scenario, the one might be the best, and in another, you might use this. So the syntax for doing a function is equals, and then the name of the function. And notice here, it's describing the function itself. And that gets different once I hit the left paren, then it's inside of the function. I've selected that function, and it's asking for the required inputs. I like to use this. Sometimes you can go this button here, this function button. You don't need to use it. You can certainly just start typing the various inputs with a comma between them. But if you use this function button, then it opens this window, which gives you a visual look of the required inputs. So for this, I want a function that pulls out the 5200. And what I'll use is called left, and it requires two things. First, it just wants to know what cell am I looking in, and then how many characters to return. And in this case, you always want those 4 digits. And it'll give you back that account number. For the department code, I'm going to use something called write, which works the same way. I want to look back at that cell here. And then in this case, I know I only want 1 digit back. I wanted to highlight here, as I type things, it tells you what it's returning over here. So when I clicked on A11, it tells you that that's going to return this data here. And right there, it tells you what the result is. So you can kind of follow along and make sure it's doing what you want it to do. And so now that's broken out those two things. And I can always highlight the cells and then double click on that little square in that bottom right corner and copy that down. My next scenario here is very similar, except for some reason I've got XL at the beginning of each one. So now I don't want to start at the very left or the very right. I just want to start in the middle somewhere so I can use the formula mid. So I type mid and my parenthesis. I start by telling it I want to refer to there. And then it wants to know the position, start number, and this is counting from the left. I want to skip the first 2 and start at the 3rd digit. So start number 3. And the number of characters I want back, these can be references. So like if I've calculated somewhere else that I want 8 digits back, it could be a reference to another cell. In this case, I know I just want 4 digits back. And that gives me what I want. So putting these together a little bit in a slightly more complicated scenario, what I've got in column A is a series of last name, comma, first name. And I want to pull out separately the first name and the last name. So to do that, again, I could look at this and try to use text columns, but using formulas, if I look at this, the divider that separates the 2 names is always the comma. So the first thing I want to do is find the comma. So I can use that formula, that function find. And this is what I need to tell Excel. The first thing it wants to know is what am I looking for? And I'm looking for text. So in Excel, anytime you're looking for text, you have to put that in quotes. So I'm going to do quote, comma, end quote. And then where am I looking? I'm looking in Smith, comma, Jane. Here, notice that this word here is not bold. That means this is an optional field. If you wanted to, you could tell it to offset. So instead of looking from the far left, I could start a certain number of characters in, which could be significant if there was going to be maybe more than one comma and I wanted to skip one. In our case, there wouldn't be, so I'm going to leave it blank. So it gives back 6. And what is 6? 6 is the location, the position number of that comma if I start counting from the left. 5 letters in Smith and then the comma. So I'm going to use that in the next 2 formulas. First, to pull out the first name. The first name is at the end. I could use a formula starting at the right, but I don't know the number of letters in the first name. So instead, what I'm going to do is start in the middle and offset from the comma. So I do mid. And again, I'm going to refer to the name. The starting number, this is where I'm going to start. And I'm going to refer to the position of the comma, but I don't want to start at the comma. I actually want to skip the comma and skip the blank space after it. So I do +2. The number of characters to return, I don't know how long the first name is, but in this case, there's nothing after the first name. So I'm just going to give it a big number to make sure I get the whole thing. And there's Jane. The last name does start at the far left. So I can use left. I can refer to Jane Smith, the Smith comma Jane again. And in this case, I want the number of characters that is the position of the comma -1. Jane Smith. And then I copy that down, and then I've got all my names separated out. In another scenario, I'm going to move on to SUMIF. SUMIF is useful for when I've got a list of names. Here again is John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and they've got dollar amounts for each one. And I want to add up all the Johns and all the Pauls, etc. So I could go here plus John, and find them all. But that is time consuming and prone to error. So instead, what I'm going to do is pull all these names, and I'm going to copy that, drop it here. Then I'm going to use text to column, or I'm sorry, not text to columns. Wrong button. Remove duplicates to get rid of all the duplicates and end up with just the population of names that are in that field. So that's useful for correcting for any misspellings. And now I know these are all the names over there. So to do the formula SUMIF, I type SUMIF, left paren. First thing it wants to know is the range of data that it's going to look through. And in this case, that's all these names here. Then it wants to know, what am I looking for? And I tell it I'm looking for that word there. So now it knows I'm looking for John. The sum range is the data here that I'm looking through to add up every time it finds the right name. And it's always going to go in the same row or the same number of cells down. So that would be my formula, and the sum of all the Johns there is this number here. Now I want to show here that on any formula you can hit F2 and see highlighted in different color boxes exactly what the inputs are. And if I needed to, I can grab those and move them around. And then I want to show if I drag this down to the next name, Paul, and do the same thing, because I moved it down, it has moved everything down a row, which in this case doesn't actually mess up the result, but I don't want it to do that. I want it to preserve looking through the correct cells. So instead, what I'm going to do is show one little trick. If I go back into here, and instead of selecting 1 to 21, I'm just going to refer to column A. And here, instead of B1 to B21, I'm just going to refer to column B. And anytime you have an option to refer to a whole column instead of individual rows, that's useful to do, because when I move that around, it's not going to get messed up. So there's some for those names. The next thing you might ask is, well, how do I know that I got everything and that this equals all that? So what I'm going to do here is this isn't really, it's the only formula I'm going to use is sum, but I'm going to say the sum of B, column B, and then do another equals the sum of column E. And if you look at that, I'm only using sum, but I put this second equal sign in the middle. And what that does is it creates a true false statement. And so it tells me that that's true. The sum of this does equal the sum of that. And if I go here and delete this one, it's now false. So that's just good spreadsheet design to build in little tests like that to make sure that what you did is right. Now we're in VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP is a little different. It's a little bit more involved. In this case, what I've got is, again, all the names, John, Paul, George, Ringo, dollar amounts for each one. And what I want is, I want to do some analysis based on these dollar amounts in the departments and in the states that this list of staff, maybe this are salespeople, and they're all in a different department and operate in different states, for example. I know that each one of these people are assigned to departments and states, but I don't have that data here in this particular spreadsheet. So I can create a lookup, and I usually do it in a separate tab. And so here's a list of all these names and the departments and states that are associated with each one. One thing to highlight is that the name here is going to be my connector. I'm going to find this name over here in lookups. And whatever that connector is, that anchor, has to be in the far left column of my lookup table here. So that's why that's there. So the formula is equals V lookup back into here. So there's a little more going on here. The first thing it wants to know is the lookup value. I'm looking for that name there. Table array is the table of data that it's going to find that name in, again, in the far left. So I'm going to select columns L to N. Column index number is when I find this name, which column of my data array am I going to return a value from? Meaning I find John, do I want the second column of data or the third column of data? So in this case, I want to return the department code, so that's the second column. Range lookup, again, you can see this is not bold, meaning this is optional. Here, I'm going to say the opposite, which is the default here is true if you leave it blank. What true will do is allow Excel to, if it gets to something that's sort of close enough, then it'll take that. I don't want it to do that. I think in every case when I use a VLOOKUP, I want to know that it's an exact match, so I'm going to type false. And if you were watching here, my answer changed when I typed false. So it pulls back 100, and that is the department code for John, so that's good. Then I wanted to show if I copy that formula over to the state, I get #NA, meaning that's a fail state, it didn't work. And then why didn't it work? If I look back in my formula, right away I can see that when I copied this over a column, everything else moved over a column also. My lookup value is now looking, instead of in column F, it's looking in G, and it's looking for $81.26. And then my table array now is looking in M to O instead of L to N. So the way I'm going to fix this is show you a different way to do the formula. If I go back here and go back into the formula, if you think about each one of these, I'll start with table array. I always want this to go L to N. So I'm going to click on that and hit F4, and that puts $ before the things that I don't want to change. And that makes them absolute references, meaning I can copy that around and it won't change it. Lookup value, on the other hand, is a little different. If I hit F4 there, it is always going to look right here at F2 and look for John. I don't want it to do that. What I want is to always stay in column F, but I want it to go down to whatever row I'm copying it to. So I can take out the $ before the 2. So I'm letting it change the row, but keeping the column. So you just have to think through kind of what you want it to do. I still get 100 here, but now, oops, now it's frozen. Okay, now when I copy that over, I still get 100 here. Why do I get 100 there? That's just because I didn't change this value, which is the column index number. I don't want the second column anymore. Now I want the third column from the array, which is the state. And now you can see it's going to give me back Virginia. So then I can highlight that, double click on this guy, and now I've got the department and state codes for everybody. And then from here, I can do whatever it was that I wanted to do with this information. And so now from there, we're going to go to COUNTIF, back to Yev.
Great, thanks, Ian. That was very helpful. So COUNTIF is conceptually kind of similar to SUMIF in the sense that you're basically telling Excel to perform, in the case of SUMIF, a sum of cells if a condition is met. Kind of similarly, COUNTIF is doing the same, except instead of returning a sum, the result of the formula is going to return a count. So the best way to demonstrate that is with an example. So in this case, earlier we showed you how remove duplicates works, and basically you're just telling Excel remove the duplicates as soon as you find them. But what if we want to know where the duplicates are and how many there are? In the case of something like that, we'd want to use the COUNTIF function. So the COUNTIF function is equals COUNTIF, and then if we open up the function window, it's going to tell us what the inputs are to have the formula work. So the first input is the range, and the range is basically where are you looking for your criteria. So in our criteria, in this case, is we're looking for this cell. So what we're saying is, Excel, count how many times in column B you find cell B2, in this case, John, and as we move the formula down, this B2 will change to B3, so it's going to count how many times Paul appears in the data set, and so on and so forth. So if we click OK, and then we drag the formula down to the rest of the data set, we now find very quickly how many counts there are of each of the names appearing in our data set. So again, that's a pretty simple demonstration of COUNTIF and what it does. And I think the best way to kind of demonstrate its power is with a slightly more advanced example. So if we look at our data set here, if we know that these are bank statement transactions for the first few days in June, and we have a date, description of the transaction and amount, and then similarly, we have a data set with similar types of information as far as a date, description, and amount from our accounting system, we can use COUNTIF to quickly identify where are the differences and where are potential reconciling items and things like that. So to do that, before we can use COUNTIF, we have to create a unique value that basically combines these three data points, the date, the description, and the amount, into one cell, and then we'll compare that unique cell to what is in our accounting system data. So to do that, we hit the equal sign, and to combine our data points, we'll click each cell, so I4, and then we'll hit the ampersand. That basically tells Excel, combine I4 with whatever you have selected next, in this case, J4, and then again, ampersand, and combine that with K4. And we do that, and now we have a unique value that combines those three data points into one cell. And if we drag that down, we do that for the rest of the bank statement data, and we will also do that for the accounting system or GL data. Now that we have the unique values in each data set, we can do a simple COUNTIF to count how many times does this transaction appear in our QuickBooks or whatever other system you use in the general ledger. So if we do equals COUNTIF, and then we open up the function dialog, again, this basically the inputs are, in our case, our range is going to be the general ledger data because we're looking for the bank statement transaction in the general ledger data. And in this case, with what Ian mentioned about absolute references, we want to hit F4 to lock that range so that it doesn't keep moving down as we drag our formula down. And then our criteria is we are looking for this unique bank statement transaction, again, in the general ledger data. And if we hit OK and we drag that down, now we see, for the most part, all of our bank statement transactions are captured in our GL data. So similarly, we'll use a COUNTIF function to go the other way to see, does our general ledger data appear in our bank statement? And so it's the same COUNTIF function, and the range is basically just reversed as well as the criteria. So in this case, our range is the bank statement data. We will again hit F4 to lock that range, make it absolute. And our criteria is we're looking for the unique general ledger transaction value. And if we hit OK, we drag that down. Now we can quickly see where our differences are. In this case, we have this one transaction on our bank statement from Nike from June 8th for $50 that is not currently in our general ledger. And similarly, we have a transaction from Amazon for $32 from June 1st that is also not in our bank statement. So again, this very quickly helps you identify where are your differences to help the bank reconciliation process hopefully go a lot smoother and faster. And so we have reached our second polling question, and it is, how often do you use pivot tables? Never, occasionally, regularly, or are you using pivot tables all day and every day?
So while you're answering polling question number 2, please now take a moment to answer. And while participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the second CPE word. The second CPE word is filter. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the second CPE word is filter, F-I-L-T-E-R. Now we're looking at the results. It looks like most of there's kind of a spread between the never, occasionally, and regular users. So hopefully we can add some value and a few key takeaways in our pivot table example today. So now we'll be discussing pivot tables. So what are pivot tables? Pivot tables are a powerful feature offered by Excel. They're a data summarization tool with the ability to quickly summarize large amounts of data. They're also known to be the single best tool for analyzing data without actually using formulas or functions in Excel. Pivot tables can be used to summarize large amounts of data, for data analysis, to group data by field, to filter a particular group of data, and to view the same data in different ways. So the first step in creating a pivot table is to create a reliable batch of source data. So this is source data that we'll be using for our pivot table example today. And a couple of notes with our source data. All of our amount column fields, which will be used for our values, they all have numbers. There are no blank columns or rows. We've removed all totals, and our columns have titles. So once you have a good, reliable source of source data, now you can create the pivot table. And so you can create a pivot table a couple different ways. Let's say you're working on a spreadsheet and you'd like to create a pivot table directly on that spreadsheet. All you'd have to do is select the cell on that spreadsheet where you'd like the table to start, select pivot table from the insert menu, and then highlight the source data. Now, if you'd like to create a table on a new sheet, all you'll need to do is highlight the source data and then select the pivot table from the insert menu. And so once the pivot table is created, a blank table will appear with access to the pivot table field menus. One thing to notice with the pivot table fields is the fields actually correlate to the column titles used in our source data. So this is what we'll actually use to populate the table. So next, you'll need to select the fields you'd like to use. So for our first example, we're going to be using account manager, state, and amount. And once those are put together, here's a view of our finished pivot table. So you can see that we're showing account manager by state. Now let's say we want to add in another field. Let's say we want to use type of service. So what we've done here is we've moved type of service to a row and then moved the account manager to a column. So now that we're showing type of service by account manager by state. So now let's get to our example. So here's the source data that we'll be using for our example today. And we're going to be inserting a pivot table directly on this spreadsheet. So we're just going to select cell H1 and then go to the insert menu, pivot table, and then select our range of source data. And be sure to pick up the account titles. So we're going to hit OK. And so we get a blank table with the blank pivot table fields menu. So now we need to select the pivot table fields we're going to be using. So for our first example, we're using account manager, state, and amount. A couple of things to note when creating pivot tables, when selecting the fields, is the account manager and state, we're defaulting to rows, and then the amount automatically defaults to a value. Also note that when you select the fields you like to use, our data comes in unformatted. So I'm going to quickly just highlight this table and then just use our basic Excel tools to format this as a number to add a column. And you can add dollar signs or remove decimals to show this how you need to see it. So this is showing us state by account manager. If you remember from our first example, we were actually showing the data account manager by state. So to do that, if you just go down here and select account manager and then drag it beneath state, now we can see the account manager by state. So looking across, we have the total by state and then the total by account manager within that state. For our second example, we were adding in type of service. So we just select type, and then so it automatically defaults to a row. Now we also moved account manager to a column. So now we're showing type of service by account manager by state. So looking across, we can see the total by state, by account manager, and then on a sub level of the type of service by account manager within each state. Now let's say we don't want to see all these states, we just want to see a couple. So we can create a filter. So to do that, if we go down to state and then drag this up into filters, the breakdown by state disappears but we're still showing the total of all states. Now up here, we can see that there's state and then an all here. So if we select the drop down, select multiple items, uncheck the all. Let's say we just want to see for PA and Virginia. So we're going to select PA and Virginia. And so now this is just the total for PA and Virginia. To see a breakout by state, if we just move that state down to a row, we can see the type of service by account manager, by PA and Virginia. And then so to get that back to show all states, we just undo what we just did. So I'm going to drag this back up here, select this drop down, hit all, okay, and then bring this back down to a row to show the type of service by account manager by all states. One thing to note is when we select our amount and it automatically defaults to our value, our first value comes in as a sum. And to see that, we drag that back over. So it automatically shows a sum of amount. Let's say we want to use a different function within a pivot table. So we're going to drag another value down here, and you can drag as many values as you like. And so this is going to default to a sum as well. But let's say we want to use a function. So we're going to go to value field settings. And then here's a list of the different functions that you can use within the pivot table without actually having to type out the function. So let's say we want to see a count. So we're going to select count and then hit OK. And so now we can see the count by type of service, by account manager, by state. So for DC, the total is 7. John and Paul only have 1, and they only have 1 catering service, where Ringo has a total of 5, and then you can see his breakout of services here. Now let's say we want to do a comparison. So we want to show a percentage of a grand total to compare the percentages between each state. So we're going to add another value. Just drag that down, hit the drop down, value field settings, and then we're going to show value as, drop down a percentage of grand total, and then hit OK. So now we can see the percentage of grand total by each state, and then within that, how each account manager makes up that total percentage. So we can see here, John has about 1%, and catering makes up that full 1%. If we look at Ringo, he has about 21%, with catering making up about 2%, and then dry cleaning about 19%. So I think that about wraps it up for our example in Excel. So now we'll just go over a couple of quick tips and tricks to remember when creating pivot tables. So when creating the source data, remember there to be no blank columns or rows in the source data. There to be no blank data cells in the source data. The source data the columns must have titles, and remember to remove the totals from the source data so that we're not duplicating the calculations. Once the pivot table has been made, if there's been a change to the source data, the pivot table won't automatically update itself. So you'll need to refresh that manually. So to do that, you can click anywhere on the finished pivot table to access the Analyze tab. So on the Analyze tab, just hit refresh, and the table will be updated with the change. You can also name a pivot table by going to the Analyze tab, Pivot Table, and then using the pivot table options. You can also rename column headings in the finished pivot table by manually overwriting those existing column headings. So for those ones that defaulted to say sum of amount or rows, if you just click in those, you can type over those like you would anything else in Excel. You can also use the value field settings to choose between different calculation functions or use multiple calculation functions. So now that brings us to polling question number 3. Can better use of Excel help save time in your company's accounting processes? Yes, no, or not sure. And while you're answering that question, I'll go ahead and provide the third CPE word for the day. So the final CPE word is data. And remember, if you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you'll need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the final CPE word is data, D-A-T-A. So it looks like most of you agree that better use of Excel will definitely help save time. So before we wrap up today, we want to answer a few of the questions submitted by our online participants and any others from the room. It looks like we have one coming in here now. Our first question is, I know you mentioned the VLOOKUP formula has to have the data that you're trying to pull in to the right of the criteria cell. How do I get around this? Yeah, you want to take on that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brendan. So yes, that is a little bit of a limitation of VLOOKUP, if you will. And I know I've had some issues with this. There is a kind of a workaround, and it's not really a workaround. It's actually a more advanced set of formulas and functions. They're called match and index, and they're two separate functions, and you have to use them together to basically get around this issue, this limitation of VLOOKUP. So it's definitely doable, but it's slightly more advanced topic and a more involved formula.
Thanks for that, Yev. Another question coming in. What does the V stand for in VLOOKUP? Ian, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. The V stands for vertical. And the reason that's considered vertical is because when you're referring back to that table, you're looking through a vertical column of data for the match, and then you're going across a row. So there's also a function which I don't use as often, but it does come up, called HLOOKUP, which works the other way around, where you're looking across a row and then down the column. So it's, I guess, about which direction you're going first.
Thanks, Ian. Another question coming in. Can you give an example of when you might use SUMIF instead of a pivot table? Do you want to take that one on as well?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of times when, like I said earlier, there are a lot of times where you can use, there's different tools to do the same thing. SUMIF, one of the things that's really nice about it is that you can still control the formatting of everything. So you can use it within data and control how the whole thing looks. An example of one way I often use it is when we're creating a statement of functional expenses for our nonprofit clients. We can use information maybe in lookups to assign columns to categories like program admin, fundraising, and assign rows to the various line items that we want, like salaries, travel, etc. And then so we can put that together and format the whole thing in a way that you can drop right into a report where a pivot table would give you the right data but wouldn't necessarily look right.
Thanks for that, Ian. Another question coming in. When working in two separate windows, should you only edit in one? Yeah, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, for the most part, when I use this concept of separate windows, I primarily use it for data comparison purposes. Just comparing two different tabs and to identify differences and things like that. I will say, if you do want to edit data, you do want to do it in one window, and I would probably default to the window that's your original window, the one that ends in :1.
Thanks, Yev. It looks like that's all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, or if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contact is listed here. With that, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We encourage you to follow us on social media at GRF CPAs and visit our website at www.grfcpa.com for upcoming events and alerts. Also, please remember to complete the emailed survey that follows if you would like to earn CPE credit for attending today's webinar. Thank you again for attending and have a great day.